Freedom of speech and the ability to protest are often seen as some of the most important rights, which have shaped the history of the United States and influenced massively important political action. Americans like to pretend that they respect the right to protest or that they recognize protests as an important form of active resistance. But they'll make it clear that what they do not support is rioting. So you see, there's a fine line between protesting and rioting, and there's no room for gray areas. It's black and white. And I mean that literally. The difference between a protest and a riot is whether it's black or white. In this country, protests are only called protests when they're white. Otherwise, they're riots. The language surrounding protests has always been charged. But more recently, overt lies and hateful rhetoric are being spread regarding protests in the United States, and like everything in our country, it's about racism. A common theme among neoliberals and conservatives is admiring the protests of the past, holding them in rose-colored lighting, while simultaneously admonishing any attempt at cultural progression today. And it has been like this for a long time. Probably most commonly, these reactionaries will point towards Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the shining example of nonviolent protests, what protests ought to be. And this is really convenient for them because most commentary on protests like the Selma March or the sit-ins is positive and in reverence. It's so easy to conveniently ignore the fact that the right's response to the Selma March as it happened was overwhelmingly negative. Senators condemned it. They called for the arrest of the marchers. The week after the FBI assassinated Dr. King, further protests swept across the country, in part due to disillusionment with peaceful action. Despite the passage of the Civil and the Voting Rights Act, very little seemed to have changed in the everyday lives of Black Americans by 1968. More aggressive action was called for, more aggressive rhetoric was used. Frequently, these protesters were met with backlash or counter-protesters or violence, which spurred escalation by the protesters. And again, when the police brutalized these protesters or when they opened fire into crowds of people marching, it was cheered on by the right. It was said to be justified against violent protests. Of course, more recently, we had widespread BLM protests across the country. These were in response to decades of over-policing and police brutality against Black Americans, and most immediately in response to the vigilante murder of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin. Now, even though these protests were peaceful, it didn't stop the right from firmly condemning BLM for riots and for burning down cities and for looting businesses. Many on the right also wanted the police to use more force against the protesters. They were cheering for tear gas, for baton beatdowns, for more arrests, despite the fact that 96% of the over 12,000 BLM protests were entirely non-destructive. If you asked Fox News, the United States was basically a war-torn country. You might have thought every major city was seeing businesses burned or looted if you turned on the 5 o'clock news. And now the same thing is happening in Los Angeles. People protesting in response to ICE kidnapping legal residents. Videos and pictures from people taking part in these protests, or aerial footage from drones, or news footage from the ground show that all these protests started and continue to be peaceful. It wasn't until unprovoked aggression from the police that protesters fought back. But again, from politicians and from right-wing media outlets, you'll see the same 4 reused clips of a burnt Waymo car, protesters throwing rocks at ICE vehicles, speeding through the streets after grabbing people, and a police car with a shattered windshield. Unless you're looking for it, you might not find videos of the National Guard intentionally firing rubber bullets at journalists. You won't see videos of ICE vehicles running over protesters marching in the streets. Just like the protests of the past, aggression from a trigger-happy, militarized police force earns these protesters the title of rioters. Hopefully you'll notice that the same state-sanctioned propaganda isn't really levied against right-wing protesters either. For example, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, doesn't matter where you look, this was simply a protest. Granted, it was a protest put on by and for white nationalists. Members of the Proud Boys, KKK, other neo-Nazi organizations were there, calling for the complete removal of Jews, queer people, and immigrants from the country and from the public sphere entirely. But even though they call for the gross and disproportionate use of violence against minoritized people, at least they didn't steal a PS4 from Target, I guess. I'm sorry if this seems flippant, but it seems pretty clear to me that right-wing protests never get called out at the same level as protests against real social injustices. And just like calling black people rioters, this isn't a new phenomenon. After the Tulsa Race Massacre, where several hundred black people died, several thousand were injured and hospitalized, sometimes for weeks, where millions of dollars of damages were done to black homes and businesses and churches, where domestic terrorists were deputized and armed by local governments, not a single family was paid reparations. Not one person was prosecuted for their vicious attacks on a black community. During the Red Summer and the autumn immediately following, domestic terrorists lynched dozens of black men and forced black families out of their homes, out of their towns, under threat of murder. Not one person was punished. Even after the insurrection on January 6th, the most blatant attempt at election interference we have ever seen, televised to the entire country after police officers were killed after the insurrectionists tried to lynch the vice president, they still aren't scrutinized nearly to the degree that anti-ICE protesters and BLM protesters are. And in fact, they all got pardoned, with some getting millions of dollars in reparations from the government. We don't even have to look at large-scale protests. 2 far-right extremists tried to kill Donald Trump. One far-right extremist broke into the Pelosi residence and assaulted the Speaker of the House's husband. Another far-right extremist assassinated 2 Democratic lawmakers. And most recently, a far-right extremist opened fire and killed 2 firefighters in Idaho. And yet, these events seem to have just disappeared from our collective consciousness. Our representatives, our media, refuse to give these blatant displays of political violence by the right any coverage whatsoever. What little they do report on, they call these rogue actors, or we hear that there's extremists on both sides. Little unrelated side note, but if it weren't so infuriating, it would be almost funny how every time there's an instance of political violence from someone on the right has to frame it as if it is the left. January 6th insurrection, oh, it was Antifa. Far-right, anti-abortion gun enthusiast makes an attempt on Trump's life, it was a Democrat. Far-right, lifelong Republican murders 2 Democratic lawmakers, it was a far-left lunatic who killed them because they weren't far-left enough. It's laughable. These are just a few of the most obvious examples, but it doesn't stop here. The amount of times that protesters have been villainized or called rioters simply because they're black or because what they're protesting is against systematic oppression and injustice is innumerable. The amount of times that the right commits political violence and it just gets brushed over, forget it, you couldn't even count. There's a striking difference between protests and riots, and it really is black and white. The line between whether your civil disobedience is called unmitigated violence and damage that must be condemned, or whether it's called a one-off and gets swept under the rug, is based on how much melanin you have. I think there's also something to be said here about the difference in the kinds of protests. Whenever there's violence in a protest against systemic injustice, it's a building or a car tagged, it's a shop with the windows smashed in, it's all property damage. When there is violence from the right, whether it is the Republican presidential nominee or lawmakers, firefighters, Capitol Police officers, people, human beings' lives are at stake. But never mind that, BLM protesters caused property damage. Never mind the fact that thousands of black men were slaughtered by the police before anything was said or done about it. To the right, it seems like human lives are replaceable, but property damage is unquantifiable. It's disgusting. In principle, we should let millions of buildings burn before letting one innocent life be taken. When people feel that they need to join a mass mobilization and demonstrate their anger, we should be asking why. What can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? To make sure that people feel safe? And instead we're playing this blame game or calling people evil outright. At the very least, we should recognize that, as Dr. King said, Riots are the language of the unheard. They aren't planned overnight because people want to go vandalize an autonomous car for no reason at all. And yet we focus on this made-up violence from the left. They're forcing the narrative, pretending there aren't deep-rooted cultural biases, pretending that peaceful protests are actually somehow violent because they're organized by the left. There is a serious problem with political violence in this country. It's not just in action, but in rhetoric, in the way that people are portrayed in the media, and it's not on the left. The unfortunate truth is, the mainstream media is reactionary. For every 100 op-eds decrying protests against the ever-encroaching fascist police state, there's maybe one or two talking about how murdering a congressman is bad, actually, or condemning the sanctioning and the encouraging of the use of force and unnecessary violence by the right. This disproportionate coverage is, in my opinion, intentional. It's pretty clear that the ruling class wants to keep benefiting from the complacency and inaction of workers. They thrive on infighting. They need to keep manufacturing this culture war. If it's not BLM, it's transgenders, or it's immigrants, or it's the next thing. The right is the perfect little lapdog for the ruling class because they eat up anything relating to a culture war. To me, it feels like while some people are fighting and protesting for actual societal change, the right just fights its own made-up war on all fronts. And don't get me wrong, the Democrats play into it, but it's certainly a major problem that the right seems to monopolize this narrative and push out this nonsense because it actually works. People buy into it. Apolitical folks who only watch the news once a week will probably believe it. They'll buy into the fear-mongering because they don't know anything else. I guess my point is, don't let media control your perception of civil disobedience. Protests are a healthy and necessary part of any democracy. People who are opposed to protests or who twist the narrative of protesting until it's beyond recognizable are against democracy. They want you to be against the expression of a fundamental human right because they're scared of what these demonstrations might bring. So keep fighting the good fight. Go to protests, make yourself heard, make your voice heard, participate in democracy. Be loud, be in the way, be curious, be skeptical, and always be kind. I'll see you next time.